All right, let's go. So we're gonna just a couple of quick things. So one is the retake exam for those of you that need to do it is going to be, I don't know yet. I don't want you to, it is not going to be this week. So any of you that need to do the retake, it's not going to be this week. So I just want you to focus on finance for now. And it'll likely be, I need to look at things. I'm either going to do a Canvas-based exam over Thanksgiving break, and you'll have kind of a choice of a couple of days to take it, or I'll do it when you get back and we'll do it face-to-face. I between now and Monday, I'm basically straight out. So I'm just kind of got the conference I'm running and everything else. So I want you to be completely focused on the finance exam right now. And then we'll loop back around on econ, and I'll get back to you as soon as I've got a better idea of when I'm going to do that. Questions about that? All right, good. So we're going to do chapter 12. It's a very short chapter. There's a couple of concepts. The basic idea is that firms will engage in competitive behavior that will equalize costs both across firms and within firms. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, imagine you have a company like Pfizer, right? And they make a cholesterol drug called Lipitor, right? And let's imagine that they can make that. Pfizer is a big company. It's a big international company. And so they have factories all around the world. And they might make different drugs in different places depending on the local market, but also the ability of the facility to produce. A lot of companies will use overseas factories. So, for example, I think I may have mentioned this in this class. I have a friend who used to work for DuPont, the big chemical manufacturing company, and they would outsource their manufacturing of some of their low-end commodity chemicals to China, but they would keep all their higher-end stuff in the United States. And so they had factories literally all around the world, but they made kind of strategic choices about where they could do different things. The main reason, well, they had a couple of reasons for why they didn't put their high-end manufacturing in China. One of them was, at the time, this was 15 years ago now, at the time, China did not have high-end manufacturing capabilities. Like there just isn't the level of skilled labor in that market. It's growing, and the Chinese market the Chinese manufacturing capacity is becoming much more sophisticated than it was. But at the time, it was less sophisticated. The other thing is China has a long history of stealing industrial secrets from American companies that set up in China. Okay, so are you going to take your really important high value things and put them in, manufacturing processes and put them in a country that does not protect your industrial secrets? They don't protect copyright, and so forth. And so that was the other reason that they didn't do it there. So Pfizer would be kind of the same idea. Now let's imagine that we have two factories, and these factories have costs, right? So factory one has a marginal cost, we'll label it MC1 for factory one, of 5 plus 5Q. Factory two has a marginal cost of 20 plus 2Q. So what do we know? Well, that factory one, if we just look at these and think about them for a minute, factory one, when we draw that on a graph, right? So we have our costs, right, and our quantity. I'm going to draw factory one down here, factory two here, All right, so how do I draw factory one's marginal cost? Let's see. Brianna, I'm going to draw factory one's marginal cost line. What's it going to look like? And where am I going to start it on that graph on the left? Where does it start? At 5? Sorry? So it's going to start at 5 right here. And then what's it going to do? What's the line going to do? Go straight across. So what's the line slope? 5. So what's that look like? It's positive, so it means it goes up, right? At a rate of 5, right? So it's going to have a slope of 5. So it's relatively steep like this, with a slope of 5. Kate, how about factory 2? Right. So it starts at 20, so way up higher. But then what does it do? Up at a rate of 2. So much flatter, right? I probably drew these a bit too dramatic. So factory one's got, now let's think about marginal cost. What does that mean? Well, factory one is if I make one more unit, it's going to cost me 5 plus 5 times whatever the quantity is. So if I'm making 1 unit in factory 5, it's going to be 5. The marginal cost would be 5 plus 5 times 1 or 10, right? If I make 1 unit in factory 2, it's going to be 20 plus 2 times 1 or 22. So if you're making 1 unit, where would you rather make it? In factory 1 or factory 2? Good. 2, right? Sorry, no. 1. Why would you rather do it in factory 1? Because it's going to cost you less, right? If I'm doing 1 unit, right, marginal cost in factory 1 is 5 plus 5 times 1 equals 10, right? So that's cheaper. Like that's 1, 10, right? If I do 1 over here, 20 plus 2 times 1, 22. I'm going to do my production at lower volume, probably at lower volumes over in factory 1 because the additional cost of doing 1 more unit is a lot less. Okay. But there comes a point where I would rather do it in factory 2. Right? If I'm doing really high volumes, I'd rather do it in factory 2. Why? Sorry? Yeah, so let's say this is, let's put in 50 instead of 1, right, for Q. So I put 50 into the marginal cost function for 1. 5 times 50 is 250, right? 5 times 50. 5 times 5 is 25. Add a 0, 250, right? Plus 5 is 255. How much is it? How much is doing 50 units in the marginal cost of doing that 50th unit in factory 2? Right, which is, sorry, not 20 times 5. 2 times 5, right? Sean, 120. So at 50, the marginal cost of producing an additional unit, right? Because the marginal cost is producing an additional unit, right? At 50, making 1 more unit is a lot cheaper over in factory 2. So you're going to want to, at higher volumes, you're going to want to produce over in factory 2. Right? Let's redraw this for a second. Same drawing. I'm just doing it because I can't erase markers. All right, so MC1, MC, or I should just say factory 2, right? Factory 1, we've got 5. I'm going to make this a little easier for me to do. So 5, 20, 2, 5Q. Let's say that the price that Pfizer is facing is 12. Now, Pfizer faces if Pfizer is facing a price of 12, that means that that this is a commodity, and Lipitor has been around for a while, so it's kind of become a commodity. It might not even be on patent anymore. So at 12, I got to make that go down a little bit. Right, at 12, price, right? If this is a straight line, price is equal to what then? If we're treating this as a commodity, and I've got, pardon the, it's not, I know I didn't draw a perfectly straight line. That's because I'm bad at my art. But let's imagine it's a straight line at 12, right? Going across there. Based on chapter 11, what we learned in chapter 11, if you see a constant price, what do you know? What is that equal to? Price is equal to, and it was relevant for this, marginal revenue, right? So marginal revenue is equal to 12. So, and it's 12 over here too. So how do I know what the profit maximizing quantity would be to manufacture in each of these factories? I would set what equal to what? Emma. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost, right? So on graph 1, where is marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, Emma? Where they intersect, good. So right here, right, is Q pi max, where MR equals MC. How about over here? Where is marginal revenue equal to marginal cost? It's kind of a trick question. It's not, right? So there's no place where it's equal to where marginal revenue and marginal cost are equal, because it's too high, right? So if the price is below 20, factory 2 would stay shut off, right? There is no quantity where running factory 2 makes sense if the price is below 2. What if the price rises to, say, 25? Marginal revenue crosses marginal cost here. Right? And we get a higher profit maximizing quantity, whatever that might be, and we can figure that out in a second. But it also, now at 25, it's above the 20, right? So 25 is greater than 20. So we're going to see factory 2 turn on. So now the question is, how many units do we make in each of these factories respectively? Well, we said profit maximizing quantity is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, right? So at a price, we'll just skip right to 25, at a price of 25, right? Or at a marginal revenue of 25, what is the profit maximizing quantity for factory 1? Well, we said that was 5 plus 5Q. So now we say 25 equals 5 plus 5Q minus 5, we get 20 equals 5Q, divide by 5, we get Q equals 4. So the profit maximizing quantity for factory 1 at a price of 25 is 4, which is not a lot, right? How about over here in factory 2? Well, factory 2 we said was 20 plus 2Q, marginal cost. So marginal revenue equals 25 because that's the price, and it's a commodity market. 25 equals 20 plus 2Q. All right, subtract 20. we get 5 equals 2Q, divide by 2. Right, we get Q equals 2.5. Again, so not very many. So yes, factory 2 would turn on once the price goes up over 20, but it takes a bit more price to get a lot of volume out of factory 2, right? So, but if we went up, so let's say price goes up to 50, right? We'll just keep playing with this for a minute. I'm not going to redraw the graphs, but if price goes up to 50, that means the marginal revenue is equal to, Sam, the marginal revenue, if price is 50, then marginal revenue must be, because in a commodity market, marginal revenue and price are the same. So 50, right? So if the price goes to 50, so now let's put 50 in, P equals 50, 5 plus 5Q, right? 45 equals 5Q, divide through by 5, we get Q equals 9. Over here, we get 50 equals 20 plus 2Q. So subtract 20 from both sides, we get 30 equals 2Q, right? Then divide by 2, and we get Q equals 15. So at a higher price, we can see that factory 2 starts to be more cost effective, right? And Pfizer would continue to use factory 1. Here's the thing, they don't shut down factory 1. They just don't do as many units in factory 1. And they start making more units in factory 2. Okay. So the marginal cost, right? The 20, the 5 and the 20 in each of these terms, right? So this is with factory 1 and factory 2, right? The cost of making each unit in factory 2 starts with a higher kind of constant amount, but factory 1, that 5 is going up at a really fast rate at 5 rather than at 2. What does that look like? Well, let's see. Let me share my screen here quick. So this is, I've talked about what assembly lines used to look like. So this is the Ford factory, Ford Motor Company back in the early 1900s, right? Ford was a genius in terms of figuring out how to organize labor in such a way to maximize the amount of effort, not an effort, but the amount of productivity coming off the lines. He used relatively unskilled labor, and what he did was he trained each of the men, and it was men only at the time. He trained each of the men to do one particular task, right? So they would stand in one place and the car would go by them, and then they'd put on a wheel or a bolt or something like that. And then the car would move along and they'd do another one, right? And so this is revolutionary. What do car manufacturing, or what do car manufacturing plants look like today? They look like this, right? Do you see any people? Right? There's like the people, the function of a person in a modern manufacturing plant like this is to take care of the machines. So that your job is to care for the machines, right? So you make sure that the computer programs are running them properly. You make sure that they're not breaking down, they've been oiled and whatnot, but you're not the one putting the screws on the car anymore. You're not the one putting the wheels on the car. You're not the one doing the soldering. Each of these red things is a great big arm with some sort of tool on the end, and it, the car rolls by and the machine goes chukunk and it makes the, right, and there's very little human to product contact. Now I'm showing you cars, but the healthcare industry is loaded with manufacturing, right? Everything from medical devices to durable medical equipment to, we've got pacemakers, we've got, artificial or implants, we've got artificial, valves. All those things are manufactured, right? Drugs, also manufacturing process. So it's the same idea, right? Just I'm showing you cars. A Pfizer plant is going to look something like this too. Now, the difference between this and this, right? Think about this. You've got a large fixed cost. You've got to get a great big building. You've got to build this assembly line, right? So there's this large fixed cost component to production. But then each of these men has to be paid too, right? And that's a variable cost. So depending on how many cars you want to make, you have to have so many men, right? And then you have, and then universally, you're going to have supply costs, like the metal that goes into making the car. That doesn't really matter. That doesn't really differ between whether you have a really sophisticated production process or a relatively simple one like this, or a relatively primitive one like this. Now here, once you buy the robot, you've got a maintenance cost to maintain the robot, right? But the robot doesn't have to be paid more if you want to do a higher volume, right? The robot itself is a fixed cost. And so you've got this even, enormous, like billions of dollars to set up a factory like this, right? Cost. But once it gets going, the marginal cost is relatively low. Like you'll still have all the metal that goes into the car. That's always going to be a variable cost, right? Whether you do it this way or whether you have a bunch of men standing on the side of the side, right? The inputs into the car will be roughly the same. So you're always going to have that. But in this process versus this process, there's a lot more variable cost here because of the labor component. And that's especially true in healthcare, right? Healthcare is heavy on labor. So if you can find processes that eliminate some of the labor by buying capital, so what we call in economics, we refer to this as the substitution of capital for labor. So I know a couple of you work in nursing homes. Any of you guys work with patient lifts? Yes? Okay. So what's a patient lift? What does it do? So it's like a sling you put around the patient, and then you kind of jack them up off their bed, right? And what does that allow you to do as a caregiver? It's a lot easier to move them. What if you didn't have the lift? Right. So it'd be harder for you. So you'd probably have 2 or 3 people having to lift somebody up, right? But with a patient lift, you wheel I've never used one, so I defer to your expertise, but the way I understand is you wheel this thing in, you strap somebody in it, you kind of use the jack to pick them up, or maybe it's electronic, I don't know, depending on right? It helps lift the patient off the bed. So you can conceivably, what you can do is you can substitute that piece of capital, right? That piece of equipment, we're referring to it as capital, just in general, right? This piece of equipment, we can substitute that piece of equipment for multiple LNAs. And you don't have that piece of equipment doesn't take vacation. It doesn't get sick. It does break sometimes, but that's, you can use it as often as you want, and it doesn't ask for overtime, right? So it is a larger fixed cost in the sense that you have to buy it, but then it reduces your variable cost. So it brings down the marginal cost of productivity, right? So when we look at lines like this, right, we're thinking about the additional cost, right? So there might be some, in this case, this doesn't show fixed cost, but it's a useful way to think about it. The cost functions, right? By making larger investments in equipment, we might be able to flatten our marginal cost curves. So even though it costs some additional cost per unit, right? That's the variable. It says the cost per unit. And then this is what I called our kicker term, right? This one comes out of Q squared, right? So that's our kicker term. If we can find a way to cut that kicker term down, and the way we're doing that is, where does that kicker term come from? Where does the one, right? So this would be something like this 20 plus 2Q would be something maybe like 0.01, right? 20Q, and then maybe, $1 million, right? So for total cost, I'm just kind of backing into that. So if I took the derivative of that, right, the 1 million would go to 0, 20Q would go to 20, and then, oh, that doesn't make sense. That's 2. Sorry, it would have to be Q. Okay, so the Q squared would become 2Q, right? Is there a way that I could make that third term smaller and make it what I just did? Is there a way I can make it 0.01Q? Well, where does that kicker term come from? It comes from competing, it comes from competing for limited supplies. So when we talked about a total cost curve that looks like this versus a total cost curve that looks like this, right? This one's got, let's say this one is 1 million plus 20Q. This one would be 1 million plus 20Q plus Q squared, right? What I'm referring to when I say the kicker term is this one here, the squared, that makes the line suddenly shoot up. Well, in healthcare, that would probably be something to do with labor, right? Once I've recruited all of the LNAs in if I want to keep on adding quantity, right? This is my quantity curve. This is my cost. If I want to keep on going out to the right, let's say I want to keep on increasing the volume of care that I'm providing in my nursing home, I need to hire more LNAs, right? And so once I exhaust all the local supply of LNAs, now I have to start getting people to move to Durham, for example, right? That's what differentiates this cost function from this one, is this term captures something about the nature of my supplies are going up at a faster rate. They're increasing at an increasing rate, okay? What if I substituted human beings for equipment? Well, I could flatten that curve out some. I'm not going to be able to flatten it out completely, but what if instead of hiring lots of LNAs to, having 3 people lifting some old person from their bed so they can go use the restroom or take a shower, right? What if I bought equipment instead? Well, it might make my fixed costs go up, let's say to 1.2 million plus 20Q, but then it might bring my kicker term down to 0.01Q. So now I'm getting something like this. That's 1, that's 2, right? TC1, TC2. I'm flattening that curve out by substituting things like machines for human beings. Okay. Now, sorry, it really should actually look like this, where I've got 1 million and 1.2 million. So I have more upfront cost, but my cost curve is flatter and longer. So that's what we're trying to capture here, right? Is there something about this process that they've probably mechanized it more? And when they go to larger quantities, the additional that squared term isn't having as much of an impact. All right. So the key here is, the key takeaway from chapter 12 is, and that's basically the whole chapter. The key from chapter 12 is this. If I've got two factories and they are I have two factories in my firm, right? And they have different cost structures. This one's probably run with a more manpower intensive process than this one is. Right? Depending on the price in the market, that will tell me how many units I want to make. And it will also tell me, do I turn on factory 2 or do I stay with factory 1? At a low price, it's not going to make sense to turn on factory 2 because factory 2, it's expensive to run at low quantities. So if we're going to run factory 2, we're going to want to make thousands of units rather than tens of units. If we're going to make tens of units, we'll use factory 1 rather than factory 2. Did I say factory 1? So if I'm going to make thousands of units, I'm going to run factory 2. If I'm going to make just a handful of units, I'll run factory 1. So this is the difference between, say, Lamborghini, right? The super sophisticated, like handmade car, basically, and a Hyundai, right? Hyundai looks like the second picture, a Hyundai car factory looks like the second picture I showed you with the red robots. Like there's no human beings putting cars together in a Hyundai factory. Maybe at a couple of points, there's something that a robot can't do, that some human beings come in and do. But most of the people in a Hyundai factory are providing the care and feeding of the robots. They're not actually building the cars. Does that make sense? Okay. And it's also part of why healthcare is so expensive. It's really hard to substitute out human beings in healthcare. When we looked in finance at at a typical hospital's budget, how much of the budget was manpower, roughly? Do we remember? 10%, 50%, 80%. Pick one. Yeah, salaries and wages. Manpower is salaries and wages, right? No, it's a little too high. 50. Very good. Thank you. It's about 50 to 60%, right? If we look at a hospital and we look at salaries and the salaries and wages line, that's going to eat up about 50 to 60% of their revenues that they bring in. Right? It's really hard to sub out nurses and doctors, right? Because healthcare is a high-touch, human-centric field. And so that's part of why it's most other industries can substitute in robots or computers or something to make it super efficient. Like if I've talked about this before, like if you haven't recently, look up like John Deere farm equipment. These things are incredible. I mean, they're basically like computers on really big wheels driving around, taking care of, farming our fields. Used to be that the marginal cost of providing food had a slope like this, right? It was very steep. If you wanted an additional unit of food, it was more manpower had to be added on. And then you were competing for manpower as opposed to, say, building a house or providing medical care, right? So that's why the slope is very high. Today, at the turn of the century, back in 1900, the majority of Americans lived on farms. I've probably said this before. The majority of Americans lived on farms back in 1900. And that was true all around the world. And we were a relatively industrialized country relative to much of the rest of the world. Now, the Industrial Revolution really kicks off in the late 1700s, 1750 or so, I think, is when they discovered the steam engine. And that's what kicks off the Industrial Revolution. And so it took a couple hundred years for it to really take place. But, at the turn of the century, that picture I just showed you is like 1920, the one of the Ford factories, like 1920, right? So 100 years ago, that's what manufacturing looked like. It was very human intensive, but we were bringing people from the fields into the factories in that time frame. Probably many, if your family has been here for a while, and you're from, say, the Boston area, chances are your grandmother worked at Waltham Watch or at one of the Lowell Mills, right? Or someplace like that, you know, probably as child labor, you know, so, you know, that's a part of our, you know, that's part of our regional history. Or maybe over in Manchester and all those beautiful, you know, the mill buildings that we're restoring now and turning them into like super expensive condos and stuff. Used to be, you know, pretty dark and unpleasant places to work, where young kids would come off the farm and go to the big city and get jobs, you know, working in the field, working in the factories, because it paid so much better than being on the farm. But the change in farming was really essential in order for the Industrial Revolution to take off. And so farming equipment, you know, back in, you know, not that long ago, pre-19, you know, up through probably the 30s, it wouldn't have been common for you to go out to the countryside here in New Hampshire and see some farmer with a horse pulling a plow, you know, tilling the field. You can't make that much food, right? You can't raise that much food if that's your technology, right? Today, we have these amazing combines that go out and they'll till the dirt, drop the seeds. I mean, it's just phenomenal to see that, right? And that has caused a collapse in agricultural prices, which is part of, if you read like the Grapes of Wrath back in high school, right, or junior high, I don't know when you read it, talk about, you know, the kind of the 1920s and the collapse of farming prices were the result of in part the result of the emergence of industrialized farming. And so if you were a farmer that knew how to, had the capital, you know, the money to, and all you could afford was a horse-drawn, you know, steel plow, and your neighbor was able to buy a tractor, right? Your neighbor was putting you to, you know, was able to farm 5 times as much acreage as you, and they could afford to sell it at a lower price. This is what your production costs look like. This is what your neighbor's production costs look like, right? And so they were able to, even though they had higher capital layouts, they could crush the competition. And so what we saw is a migration of people from agriculture out to the cities, where they started looking for factory jobs. Right? So that's also part of chapter 12, is talking about, where do people go? How do people know that it's time to leave an industry and change to another one? Well, it's when your wages start falling and you see across the way somebody else is doing something else, and you're like, you know, I'm making $10 an hour and Linda's making $25 an hour. I think I could do what Linda does. Let me, you know, see if I can get a job over there, right? And so people follow prices. People follow prices, in this case, wages that we're talking about. So, okay, so chapter 12, the big thing here is that prices will tell you how much to produce, and it will shift how much is produced and where, right? So at high prices, firms that have high marginal costs, high but flat marginal costs, will produce a lot more than firms with low but rapidly rising marginal costs. Think of this as, I mean, almost in your lifetime, certainly in your parents' lifetime, you know, certainly in your grandparents' lifetime. You know, when I was a kid in high school, I lived in Keene, and there were a handful of like local shops. Like if you wanted to go buy clothes, there was a place called Good Nows, and there was I don't know, a handful of places that were all owned by local families with, you know, their names on them. And then finally, long after I had graduated, the Keene was very regressive. It didn't want any big box stores in for decades and decades, right? And so if you wanted to go, school shopping at the beginning of the year, you'd drive to Manchester, which is a good hour drive, so you could go to the mall in Manchester. So you had very limited choices. My wife grew up in Keene, and she remembers they did school shopping by going to the Sears store and looking at the Sears catalog, and you would place an order in the Sears catalog and then wait 6 weeks, and it would come into it would come by mail to the Sears store, and when you would go pick it up. I mean, think about it. Like, can you imagine waiting 6 weeks for something that you wanted, right? I mean, you go on your phone and Amazon, it'll be there tomorrow, right? That is not how life was. Anyway, so finally they gave up on that. Somehow, I don't know how they finally convinced the town to let in. I think Walmart finally sued them, and then Walmart came in, and a couple other big box stores came in and crushed all the little mom and pop stores, right? And all those mom and pop stores are gone. Now they're kind of back, but now they're super sophisticated. Like, they don't sell like Levi's jeans anymore. Like the ones that survive now are super high end. They're like the Lamborghini kind of, because you've got Walmart down the street. If you want jeans, you go to Walmart and get, a pair of jeans for $20. But Walmart does that by having high fixed costs and low marginal costs, right? Relative to your mom and pop that has low fixed costs and high marginal costs. That's an opposite perspective. All right, that's chapter 12. So the key lesson there is the equalization of price price across, tells you where to produce, right? It also tells you where to go look for a job, right? You go and you hear from your friends, hey, I'm making a lot of money working as a nursing home administrator, or working as I'm working at Boston Children's, I'm making a bunch of money, whatever, right? You're going to follow that information. All right. We have been talking, so in chapter 10 and 11, we've been talking about perfect competition. It's characterized by commodity-like products. True commodities like oil, wheat, corn, all these things are very important for public health, right? With the Russians going in and massacring the Ukrainians, we are seeing a massive public health crisis, setting aside all the Ukrainians running away because the Russians are bombing hospitals and schools and nursing homes because they're barbarians. We are also seeing Ukraine, if you don't know it, is one of the major agricultural producers in the world. They produce a significant percentage of the world's wheat, world's sunflower, and like if you look on the ingredients of your things you buy, you got a lot of sunflower oil. You probably don't even realize you're eating it. So they produce a lot of wheat and corn. They also produce a bunch of oil, and all those things have been stopped as a result of the Russian aggression. Not going to hurt us in the United States that much because we produce all of that stuff too, right? The United States has the remarkable blessing of having an incredible diversity of geography, such that we could basically close our borders, stop trading with everybody in the world, and the prices we pay would go up a little bit. But most of the world doesn't have that choice. And so there are a lot of countries that are reliant on Ukraine for wheat and corn and other food products, and those folks are going to start to starve this year. And then, of course, the oil issues in Europe and gas that they've historically purchased from Russia, and they're not, is going to create a different public health crisis where people in Germany aren't going to be able to keep warm in the wintertime, and it's cold in Germany, in case you don't know that. And so we've got a lot of public health issues going on. So when I talk about stuff like commodities like oil, wheat, and corn, you should care about that as a public health, as a person who's interested in public health. So we're talking about commodity products like that, but we've also used, generic drugs as a similar example, right? Things like ibuprofen, ibuprofen, right, which is generic Motrin, cetirizine, which is we call it inhibitor. It's one of the things I take. It keeps you from getting heartburn, right? There's a bunch of generic drugs. Those are like commodity trade too. And what did we say that's characterized by? We said there's this huge global market for things like, ibuprofen, right? And it's like a quantity in the billions, right? And the price is, probably small, like $2 per whatever. So it's billions of, not dollars, billions of quantity, right? And it's characterized by so we have a global price that comes out of this global trade, right? But who's operating in here is lots of small firms as producers and suppliers who, if there's billions of units out there, maybe the producers only produce hundreds of thousands of units, or the buyers maybe only buy thousands of units. And so you've got this right? You've got this market where there are lots of buyers and lots of sellers, and they're both small. So lots of buyers, lots of sellers, all small, right? And such that they can't, they have no ability to set prices. And so the effect they have is they face this global price of, say, $2, and that gives us that horizontal line. Nothing that you as a producer can do. There's nothing that you as a producer can do in this market to affect the overall price, the global price, because you are small and the market is big, right? So you just you take price as equal to your marginal revenue, and you look at your marginal cost and you figured out what your profit maximizing quantity is, right? And that's what we did in chapter 11. But most of what you buy is not a commodity, right? Guys have Apple computers. An Apple computer is different than a Windows computer, right? I mean, I'm a Windows guy, and I know that's true. And I actually have a preference for Windows, but that's just because that's what I'm used to. Everybody tells me if you go to Apple, you'll never come back. But I've always been Windows, so that's what I'm comfortable with. But I do acknowledge there is a difference, right? We've got LL Bean boots, right? There's, that's not a, and we've got Nike sneakers, and we've got, and I can, go around the room, and, we've got fancy water bottles and Dunkin' Donuts coffees, right? They're all different. Like a Dunkin's is different than a Starbucks. So we have product differentiation. Right? There's a difference between a Bean boot maybe and a Patagonia boot to like a boot that you might buy at Walmart made by Joe, right? Or whatever their fake name is that they use. Right. And so we see that there are differences. And when we have differentiation, right, we can firms start to have market power. Why? Because think about this, it's different. So a Apple iPhone, I do have an iPhone, right? So I had a Galaxy at one point, went over to the iPhone. Like I see a difference there. I'm willing to pay more for an iPhone than I am for a Galaxy because I've got there's a bunch of reasons, but like I've got all my apps are set up for Apple now and all these accounts that are fixed to my phone. So it's a hassle to switch. So I'd be willing to pay more for that Apple because of that, Apple phone because of that. But it could also be, so Apple as a result has some market power because we have preferences for that. But it could also be that I've got a firm that just has some natural economies of scale. Natural economies of scale. So economies of scale. And you have an economy of scale if when you make more of something, the average cost per unit goes down, right? So if I have a function like, if I have a total cost function of something like 10,000 plus 2Q, right? What's my average total cost? Molly, how do I figure out average total cost? Exactly. So I take this 10,000 plus 2Q and I divide it by Q. And I can then say, okay, that's the same thing as 10,000 over Q plus 2Q over Q. Right? So 2Q over Q is just 2, right? And then that's, got to leave that there, but it's 10,000 over Q plus 2. So ATC. So at a quantity of 1, what's my average total cost? $10,002, right? 10,000 divided by 1 is 10,000 plus 2 is 10,002. Okay, that's really expensive to make 1 unit of something, whatever it is, unless it's a Lamborghini, then we're, what if we made 10,000 units? So Q is 10,000. What's my average total cost? We're just going from one extreme to the other. 3, right? 10,000 divided by 10,000 is 1, plus 2 is 3. So what happens, just using those 2 data points, what happens as I increase quantity? My average total cost goes down, right? My average total cost goes down. So this firm, if this were a real firm, this firm would have economies of scale. As they make more of something, their costs go down, right? If we were going to draw that, if we were going to draw average total cost, this particular average total cost, right? It would do something like, it would start really big, 10,002, right? And then it would get really small, Because what's the marginal cost, by the way, for that cost function? Allie. Right. Yeah, marginal cost is 2. The 10,000 goes to 0. The 2Q, that's Q to the 1, right? We bring the 1 down in front, 1 times 2, and that's Q to the 1 minus 1, that's Q to the 0, that's 1. So 1 times 2 times 1 is 2, right? So all that's left is 2. So the marginal cost is 2. So what we expect to see here is as we increase quantity, right, it gradually goes from a really big number, 10,002, and then when it's up to 10,000, it's down to 3, right? And if we kept going, if we made it 20,000, 10,000 divided by 20,000 is a half, right? A half plus 2 is 2.5. If we made this 100,000, 10,000 divided by 100,000 is 1/10. So now we're at 2.1, right? If I keep making that Q bigger, what's going to eventually happen? The overall thing is going to approach, this is going to approach 0 exactly, right? As this Q keeps getting bigger, the value of this ratio keeps going to approaches 0. And eventually it approaches 2, which is the marginal cost, right? So what I'm drawing here is the average total cost starts really big and keeps going down and keeps approaching the marginal cost. So this is what an economy of scale looks like. Okay. So it would make sense for this firm to try to produce as many units of whatever it does as possible, right? Because its cost is low. So let's think about, where do we really see this in real life? Well, one of the things that killed a lot of people back in the day was water, right? Was bad water. We all have to drink water. If you don't drink enough water, you die. Like, it's just kind of like a thing. How many of you guys know the story of Jon Snow? Not the Game of Thrones dude, the English dude. Okay, so what did Jon Snow do? What's he famous for? Remember? Yep. Who wants to help? What was wrong with the water? Yep. Yep. Yes, it does. Cholera. Yes, good. All right. You all took public health. I know you heard about Jon Snow. He's like the savior of the saint of public health, right? So Jon Snow, right, said there was a cholera. There was cholera in London. People kept getting cholera, and Jon Snow was one of the first people to like map out where are people actually getting sick. Like, he had a map and he was keeping track of, he was using basic epidemiology, like tracking where people are actually sick. And he was able to eventually figure out that there was this one pump that people were using in this neighborhood, that if you drank the water out of that pump, you got cholera. So because back in those days, in the morning, you would open your window, right? And what would you throw out your window onto the street? Your waste from the night, your night soil. That's one of the nice, right? Because you didn't have flush toilets. So you peed and pooped in a bucket, and then in the morning, because it was stinky, you open your window and you're out into the street, right? And then where does that go? Well, oh, by the way, your pump, where you're getting your water, is just down the road there, right? And so, without proper sanitation, the yucky stuff winds up in the water supply and people get sick. And cholera is one of the classic diseases that you get from poor sanitation, right? Today, we don't, in the United States, if you get cholera, something is really messed up, right? But it used to be not an uncommon thing to see because we didn't have good sanitation. So sanitation is one of the great innovations of public health. It's probably done more to save more lives than any other medical intervention. Any medical intervention. It's not really even a medical intervention, right? It's just sanitation. It's public health. Public health has saved more lives than any medical intervention, period, right? It's like things like clean water matter a whole lot, right? Adequate nutrition matters a whole lot. If you are on the edge of starvation and you get the flu, you die. But if you are, well fed and you get the flu, you're miserable for a week or so, right, Sean? And then you get better, right? And you're fine. Right. So poor people back in the day, not that long ago, poor people were all skinny. Today, poor people in the United States are mostly have obesity problems. Why? Because they eat cheap calories at places like McDonald's, they buy their food in gas stations. I've read one person said, we have the average American spends his or her day grazing in places like gas stations and convenience stores and fast food joints. So we have an epidemic of obesity in the United States because calories are so cheap. That wasn't true as recently as, say, 75 years ago. Right? It wasn't true. And so in my lifetime, the average American has become much heavier, right? Much fatter. And that's mostly because calories are so cheap. And so John Snow figured out, using a basic, basic epidemiology, figured out, okay, there's this water pump. It's pumping from groundwater that has been contaminated with cholera. And so they had to fight with the locals because the locals were like, that's the best water. And he's like, that's going to kill you, right? But they were like, no, it tastes good. And so they had to weld it shut, and then the locals would come and open it back up again. They start drinking it again. I mean, it was a whole fight with the locals to get them to stop drinking the water because they didn't believe, frankly, they didn't understand germ theory. Like, that was also a relatively, I don't even know if Snow knew germ theory. I can't remember the timing. But he may not have even realized, what he was onto. He just knew that if you drank out of that particular well, you'd get cholera and then you'd likely die. And then again, if you were an undernourished average Londoner back in the 1800s, if you got cholera, because because you were already kind of at the edge of starvation, your immune system wasn't very good, and you would die. There's a reason why the average lifespans were so short back then. It's because doing simple things like what you ate, what you drank could kill you. Still could kill us today, but we're so much better at making sure that the food supply and the water supply are safe. So talking about water supply, where do you guys drink water from? Where do you get your water for bathing and cooking? I realize some of you probably drink Evian, but okay, so when you're cooking or you're bathing, where does your water come from? Let's start very practically. What do you do to get water at home? You turn on the tap. All right, good. Let's trace that a little bit. Where does that water come from? Pipes into your house, right? Yeah, okay. Right. So there's some reservoir, right? So UNH, the reservoir for UNH is Oyster River back in College Woods. Probably, if you haven't been out there, it's a lovely little trail. I was there this morning with my dog, walked down to the dam, and we looked at the water and then came back up, right? That's the UNH water supply, right? So, so we've got this, and if you're back in that area, you've seen the pump house. It's this giant new building that they just built, and with fields where they oxygenate the water and stuff like that, right? And then they run pipes all around through UNH. Durham has a different water system and water supply, right? Water treatment supply. I'm actually not on Durham water. I live just like a quarter mile past where they run the pipes for water. I actually have a well at my house. But if you live, most of you are from the Boston area. That means that most of you are not on wells. So most of you are getting your water from a reservoir somewhere that's then treated by the local, either there may be a private company that's contracted with your town, or the town might run the water itself, right? And then the town runs pipes out from the water supply point, to all of your houses. That's a very expensive process, right? You think about, just look at the madness we've got going on behind us on the street, and that's all like pipes, like they're laying new pipe, right? Like think about how much money that has cost you in it. I don't even know exactly what they're doing. I think it's steam pipes, but I'm not sure. But just think, like doing the initial layout of water mains through a town, even as small as Durham, the amount of cost that would be. It's an enormous fixed cost, right? Right. So it'd be an enormous fixed cost, right? But once it's in place, so it'd be an enormous fixed cost, millions and millions and millions. Just for a small town like Durham, it'd be probably $100 million, something. Maybe more, probably more, right? Because you've got to dig all these holes, run all this pipe, connect it all together, build the water station that's going to purify the water, right? On and on and on. This huge fixed cost. But once everything is set, once the station is built, once all the pipes are run, right? The variable cost per gallon of water that you're getting out of that system, probably pretty small, right? Some chemicals, some electricity to pump it. It's not nothing. Don't get me wrong. It's not nothing, but it's like, relatively speaking, it's like nothing, right? I want to say my water bill when I used to be on city water in the various places I've ever been, $100 a month, something like that. I don't know. It's probably not even that much. Like it's a nothing bill to anybody who's kind of in the middle class, right? Obviously, there are some people who that would be a struggle for. But for anybody who's in the middle class, having water is like a nothing cost. It used to be, like back in Jon Snow day, like if you wanted water, you had to, get a bucket and go down to the pump. And that was actually pretty, awesome, because it was coming out of a pump instead of having to like truck down to a river or something like that. So the initial infrastructure investment is our fixed cost, and then the variable cost is very low. So having a water system has a structure that looks like this, right? So having public water is a structure that looks like this, where it's a falling average total cost over a long period, a large quantity. It's falling over a large period. So given that you have this, and let's say for sake of argument that it wasn't the town of Durham, because the town of Durham does run the water here. There isn't a private company, but let's say some of the places you might be from, you might have a private company that runs the water supply with a contract with the city or wherever you're from. But be that as it may, regardless, does it make sense for somebody else in Durham, let's say, to build a competing water supply, run pipe all over the city, right, or the town rather, run a parallel system of pipe all through the town? No, right? Because you'd have, now you're reducing the quantity and your average total cost is actually going up. Emma, thoughts there? Was that no, I was, okay, sorry. I don't know if you had some deep insight into water supplies that you wanted to share. Okay. So when you have falling average total cost, this is the basis for what we call a natural monopoly. Right, so a monopoly is one seller, many buyers. Seller has market power. A natural monopoly has falling average total cost over the relevant range of quantity. So, sorry, I'm running out of space here. Natural monopoly is falling average total cost over the relevant range of quantity, right? So the relevant market. So for Durham, water supply would look like this. For the relevant range of all the people who would want water in Durham, right? The queue going out far enough. The average total cost for supplying water in Durham would be falling throughout the range of possible demand. Okay. So a natural monopoly then is a situation where if somebody came in and offered to or tried to build a competing business, the existing business would just be able to cut its prices, and it wouldn't make sense for the competitor to try to come in because it would cause prices to go up. So a natural monopoly is a situation where you have falling average total cost, right? And so there's going to be just one supplier, because if I add more demand, it just reduces my price even more. So I'm able to sell it even cheaper than before. So that effectively keeps, so there's nobody's trying to be like, oh, you know what I really want to do? I want to set up a competing water supply with the town of Durham. Like, that's dumb. It just doesn't work. Right? And most of the places you're from, it's not gonna make any sense. Right. So monopoly is one seller, many buyers. So we're in the town of Durham, the town water supply is basically a monopoly. Now, I'm off the grid, but if I were on the grid, I would buy my water from town because it wouldn't make sense for me to try to get it, some other way. Town can provide it to me very inexpensively. Okay. So, so this is a relatively rare phenomenon, right? So it's kind of the opposite extreme of commodities, where a true monopoly is kind of the opposite extreme of commodities, where you have one supplier, many buyers, and the supplier has all the market pricing power, right? So a monopoly or monopolies, right, are price makers, and the consumers are price takers. What do monopolists do? Well, because they can set the price, monopolists will set price greater than marginal cost and greater than average total cost, right? Sorry, that shouldn't be laid out like that. Greater than marginal cost there. So monopolists will set a price greater than average total cost so that they can get excess profits like we've been talking about. Now, monopolists don't face, because we have differentiated products, and let's set aside water for a minute, but thinking about stuff like, thinking about more like things like iPhones, we have differentiated products. We can choose between the Galaxy, the iPhone, some other thing, right? Monopolists will face, instead of a constant fixed price, pure competition, right? Or perfect competitive, right? P is equal to MR. What monopolists face is our standard demand curve, downward sloping, right? Demand curve. and they can choose a price. And they know if they set a high price, their quantity will be relatively low, and they'll get a high price times a, and if they choose a high price, P1, they'll get a relatively small quantity. If they set a low price, P2, they'll get a relatively large quantity, right? And we know that total revenue is equal to P times Q, right? So the area under the P and over to the Q represents our total revenue. So they'll be looking to increase their total revenue, but they're also concerned about their costs. So let's focus on revenues for a minute. What does total revenue look like when you have a downward sloping demand curve? Not sure if that's sharing correctly. I have just about enough time to do just this. Let me do that again. I want to share this one. Let's assume we have a relatively simple let's assume we have a relatively simple demand curve. P equals 10 minus Q. All right, what is our total revenue if P equals 10 minus Q? Well, total revenue is P times Q, right? So if I substitute in 10 minus Q for P, then I get 10 minus Q times Q. So my total revenue then is 10 minus, so I'll just do it again. 10 minus Q, total revenue is equal to 10 minus Q times Q. I distribute the Q and I get 10 times Q minus Q times Q is Q squared. Good. And then, so now my total revenue function is 10Q minus Q squared. My marginal revenue then would be what? 10Q becomes what? 10. And then 2Q become, Q squared becomes 2Q, right? All right. We'll start there next time.